2 weeks ago, we finished up our series called The Beginner's Guide to Predicting Your Future. And we came to, it was a 4-week series, we came to the conclusion of that series, and we simply asked the question, what does love require of us? What does love require of us? And if you're here today and you go, well, what do you mean us? Well, we can generally just throw that out to all humanity. I don't think that that's a question that is only for a certain amount of people. I think that's an honest question. What does love require us as human beings? Specifically, I would say, what about those who are Jesus people, those of us who have said yes to Jesus Christ, and you are Christian? And what I mean by Christian, sometimes I'm almost afraid to say I'm a Christian, not because I'm afraid of Jesus Christ, but I'm afraid of what this world and our culture has defined Christian as. And if we go back to first century and we look in the book of Acts, and that's the whole kind of telling of how the church got started after Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, and then him going back to heaven, and then sending the Holy Spirit and launching this movement, this movement of people that has been on the march, that has been on the move now for 2,000 plus years. And what would happen, we find in the book of Acts that first of all, there was this group that started was just called the Way, because Jesus often said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except by and through me. And that made a bunch of religious people really mad. And so he just kept saying, I'm the way, I'm the way, I'm the way. And so this cult, as what the Jews thought it was, after Jesus' resurrection, and they tried to spread rumors that somehow these disciples came in and overthrew this Roman guard and somehow, rolled this stone away and snatched Jesus's body out of the grave. That's how it happened. I don't think that happened, right? And so all of a sudden, not only is his grave empty, but now Jesus is seen by hundreds of people walking and talking. And that's what we're going to be celebrating on Easter in just a few weeks. Can you believe Easter, I think, is like 7 or 8 weeks away? So are you happy about that? Yeah. Boy, that sounds like it, man. We need some serious dose of caffeine in us this morning, and I'm working hard to get you guys to wake up here a little bit. But hey, so that's how this church movement started. People just started calling it the Way, short for Jesus people who talked about that Jesus is the way. And then all of a sudden, people who didn't look like each other, there was like Jews and Gentiles. Somebody asked me today, well, what was a Gentile? Anybody that wasn't a Jew was a Gentile, right? And back in the old days, back in that day, there was only 2 ethnicities. There wasn't about race. There was only one race, the human race, but there was basically 2. There was Jews and everybody who was not. And there was a real dividing line. There was a dividing line in culture. There was a dividing line in the God that they served, how they acted toward each other. It was very different, the Jewish culture versus every other culture in the world. So in the book of Acts, now all of a sudden you've got Jews and Gentiles. You got people who had hated each other, who had feared each other, who had despised each other, all of a sudden coming under one umbrella because they were following Jesus Christ. And so all these people who had been known to hate each other started kind of loving each other. And the craziness, they started loving other people even though they weren't following Jesus. And these little Christ, that's how they became known as Christians. These people were acting like little Christ because Christ loved the world so much that he gave himself for us. And he would allow anybody to approach him. And he would approach anybody. And people who were nothing like Jesus like Jesus. And guess what? He liked them back. And that is how the term Christians came about, because all of these people who had nothing in common had this one thing in common, Christ, and they started acting like him. Now that's the kind of Christian I want to identify with, right? And so today, 2,000 years, fast forward, here we are in all kinds of craziness. And some people say it's the worst that it's ever been. I don't know. I think you can go back in time and you can go, oh my gosh, there's been a lot of dysfunction. There's been a lot of hate and hurt over the years, especially even in our own country. But when you think about around the world, and yet here we are, a church, Renovation Church, coming together in what has been a Catholic facility for 100 years. If you weren't basically white Polish Catholic for 100 years, you didn't come in here. They did their mass in the original Polish language. The priest that was here, he was from Poland. In fact, the entire time that 10 years ago when we were negotiating and purchasing this campus, the priest that was here, I never met him because he was back in his homeland the entire time. Poland, right? And so now we've taken this campus, a 100-year-old campus of bricks and mortar, and we've invited anybody and everybody to come into this space. And we love it. But here's the reality. As if you look around today at 9:30 and at 11:15, our hope and our prayer was that somehow we would be a reflection of our community. And I didn't realize all of the things when I started thinking about planting a church in the city and all of these things. And I didn't know a lot of history about Buffalo. I've learned a lot about Buffalo and its history over the last 10 years. Still today, one of the crazy things is that Buffalo is still the 6th most segregated city in America. The 6th most segregated city in America. Today, there are pockets of our city that is just flourishing. I mean, amazing, and I'm happy for it. But how is it today that when we have more money flowing into the city, how is it possible that the kids of the city of Buffalo, 18 years or older, are the second poorest kids in the United States? How is that possible? Now, if you're a guest or if you're new to Renovation, you just got to understand, we talk about things that sometimes a lot of churches don't talk about. And it gets a little uncomfortable at times. And I will say this, that I know that I'm white, right? And so for some in the room, you might be surprised because you don't know what I am. Depending on the kind of hat I'm wearing, I could be Cuban, I could be Puerto Rican, I've been called all kinds of different things. One time I said, hey, I'm white. I'm a white pastor, and I'm walking out, and a lady sitting over on the left, she goes, come here. You're white? I said, I am. I'm white. She goes, I can't believe it. I've been telling my daughter I've been going to an Hispanic church this whole time. I said, see, that's about all the Spanish I know. And so when I share these things, I'm coming from now I do declare as a Native American. So I'm a card carrying, on my mom's side, I come from the Potawatomi Nation. And so I'm proud of that. But we did not grow up identifying with that Native American, even though just 2 generations up full-blooded Potawatomi, right? On my mom's side, dad's side, great-grandfather's side, and then on my father's side, Cherokee. And so just a couple of generations up, there is full-blooded native blood that's flowing through. And you know how that gets kind of weeded out and everything. But that's, if you wonder, like, what are you? I'm a little of this and I'm a little of that. But I have to admit, I can't identify. I can't now pull the Native American card all of a sudden and go, yo, I'm Native American. Because that wouldn't be honest. That's in my blood, but that's not been my culture. And my culture has been white. And I grew up, my parents, I love my parents. I love how I grew up. I love my family. I love all that I got to see and learn. And my dad was a pastor in the early 70s, planting a church in Kansas City, Missouri. And he was a forerunner. He hired African Americans on his staff. I had no idea. I just thought everybody did that. Come to find out years later, looking back and having conversations with my dad about that, I'm like, whoa, you had death threats? You had people leave because of that? He said, yeah. I'm like, wow, had no idea. And so there's kind of a generation of that's passed on. But some of the things, and I talk about this, and I talked about this 2 weeks ago. I grew up, and I grew up in a setting where virtually all perspective when it comes to theology, when it comes to the church, when it comes to the gospel, was through the lens of whiteness. And when I say whiteness, I mean white, evangelical, loving God, loving our country, patriotic. This was a God-fearing country that was founded on biblical Judeo principles. And I believe that. And that was just kind of, and at some point, and I will just say this, and if that was kind of your tradition, if you kind of grew up in that, my generation on up especially, you identify basically your Christianity and your love of this country because of in God we trust. You mixed all of that together. And anytime that there's a conversation that pushes against those kind of that love of God, love of country, and love of church, that gets all mixed in together. And any time that it's pushed against that, I would just say the whiteness of my folks, of brothers and sisters, we really struggle with that. And so one of the things that I have learned and is still learning over these years is that white does not make right. In my theology, in my understanding of church, and all of those things. That it isn't necessarily that it was wrong, it's just very incomplete. And so here at Renovation, we are attempting to bring a holistic gospel to our city. And when I mean holistic gospel, I mean what Noel Cassiano says in his book, Where the Cross Meets the Road, a holistic gospel that says that the gospel isn't just about, and this is kind of the tradition I grew up in, and maybe you would identify with this, 99% of anything and everything that was spoken at or preached about or any kind of program, Sunday school, discipleship, was about personal salvation, about making sure that your eternity is secure. Many times, pastors, evangelists will come in, if you die today, do you know without a shadow of a doubt, if you took your last breath, your next breath would be in heaven? And that is a great question, and that's a question that we all need to answer. But that's not the whole gospel. We sung about heaven on earth. We talked about not just one day when we die, but this day as we live. And so the gospel for us here at Renovation is a holistic presentation of the gospel. Yes, we want to secure our salvation in Jesus Christ one day when we take our last breath, so that we don't have to mourn as others mourn, as the Apostle Paul says. And so our growth and our discipleship, that's important. But also we understand, and we're going to see just in just a minute here, how the Apostle Paul talks about that we need to meet the pressing needs of our community. That means an appropriate demonstration of compassion. Jesus always showed up with an appropriate sense of compassion. He didn't do everything for everybody, but he did show compassion in pressing needs. And then another area that I never really thought was a part of a holistic gospel was that the church and the people of the church are going to take responsibility for the brokenness of maybe marginalized communities, and we're going to champion restoration and development. We're going to champion to make sure that there's for places to work, and that there's good employment and there's opportunities of employment. That it's not just about we're going to give fish away, right? But we're going to teach people how to fish. But the problem is that sometimes in communities like the one I live in Riverside, you could teach somebody how to fish, but there ain't no fish in the pond. So what do you do now when, hey, I'm ready, I've been trained, I've done my part, but there is no access to livable, affordable jobs that allow me to have any sense of dignity and any kind of sense of an understanding of work? And maybe is this really an American dream, or is it an American nightmare? And then there's another component that kind of rounds out what a holistic gospel would look like. And this is the part that I had no idea about. And that's the confrontation of injustice. That there are systemic things in place that causes people to have deep generational poverty. That education systems and all of these things that are in place, where housing, where all people have the same ability to be able to buy a house. I did not realize until in my adult years, I never even heard of redlining. Had no idea that was a thing. And so when we talk about a holistic approach to the gospel, that's what we're talking about. And today, I'm just going to, and I don't know if this is going to be a series or if this is going to be just kind of one of these conversations that we're just going to come rolling back to, and I'm going to say, hey, guess what? We're in between series, and we're going to be talking about being a woke church. And you'll know that's kind of code for going, okay, we're going to dive in today. But here's the thing, I've been reading and I've been trying to understand, and I've got some mentors out there, and I've met some of my mentors, and some mentors I've never met, but I've read a lot of their books. You know what I'm saying? Hopefully you've got some mentors out there that are helping you shape your values, your understanding, and perspective. And here is a book, and here is one of my heroes. I've been to several of his conferences, but it's Dr. Eric Mason. He pastors Epiphany Church in Philly, and he wrote a book just a few months ago that was released, and it's talked about woke church, and it's an urgent call for Christians in America to confront racism and injustice. Now, I thought it would be appropriate for us to talk about woke church on Daylight Savings Day, because we need to wake up. But not just our physical bodies, we need to wake up our hearts and our minds and our spirit. So I'm going to read some inserts from this, starting out from one of my probably top 2 or 3 champions of the faith, Dr. John Perkins. And so I'm going to read through some of these things, and then we're going to watch a video, and then with the time remaining, I'm going to ask Dina to come up and to speak, or we're just going to come up and have a little conversation about that. So you guys good? Turn to your neighbor and say, I'm good. I'm going to wake up. This is intro of this book was written by Dr. John Perkins. Dr. John Perkins is now almost 90 years old, and all you need to do is Google Dr. John Perkins and follow his story. It is amazing. But this is what he wrote. He says, I can still vividly remember what life was like growing up as a black boy in southern Mississippi in the 30s and 40s. In our little town, when we saw a white man and a woman coming down the sidewalk, we stepped to the side and let them get by. Everything was separate. There were separate theaters, separate waiting rooms, separate water fountains. There were even separate restrooms. And while there were restrooms for white men and white women, there was just one for blacks, and it was never cleaned. My mother died when I was 7 months old, and the police killed my brother when I was a boy. But it wasn't until I was badly beaten in a Brandon jail in Mississippi that I saw the absolute necessity for reconciliation. It was there that I saw the depths of racism. I wanted nothing to do with white people after that, but while I recovered in the hospital, white doctors and nurses cared for me, washing my wounds and loving me. We were healing each other. And that's when I prayed, Lord, I want to preach a gospel that can reconcile, that brings blacks and whites together in one body. But before I started striving for reconciliation, I had to face the horrors of racism. Today, I worry that we've forgotten our past and remain in denial about many of the challenges we face in the present. There's a tendency to want to gloss over injustices for the sake of unity. However, any authentic attempt to pursue unity and reconciliation must start with the truth. The journey toward healing begins with an awakening. No longer can we remain asleep to the injustice in our past and present. No longer can we afford to see justice issues as separate from the gospel. No longer can we wait for someone else to do the hard work of reconciliation. In his letter to the Ephesians, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Paul was challenging the church to throw off their old ways and walk in the light, and we still need this call today. Dr. Eric Mason starts out the book talking about the volcano in Hawaii that erupted on May 17th, 2018 at 4:17 a.m., spewing lava more than 1,000 feet in the air. Homes and other structures in the wake of the lava flow and the eruptions related ongoing events were destroyed. But geologists say that the volcano has been erupting almost continuously since 1983. One eruption is followed by a period of calm. Maybe another year or so of quiet that allows people to relax and forget. Then another eruption. Because volcanoes are formed with the tectonic plate shifts over a hot spot in the layers of the earth beneath the surface, we never know exactly when or where they will erupt. Dr. Mason says the issues of racism and injustice are like that volcano. They form a hotbed of lava that lives just beneath the surface, and at any moment they can explode violently, as it happened in Charleston, South Carolina, when Dylan Roof went into a black church, gunned down 10 worshipers. Or these issues can fuel the subtle microaggressions that minorities experience on a daily basis, like being ignored when they go into shops for service, or being followed because they assume they're stealing. But the evangelical church seems to be asleep to the hotbed of tensions that threaten to overflow into communities across America. Scripture makes it clear that we are supposed to be totally awake to what is happening in our world and steadfast in our commitment to fulfill the great commandments. Jesus fulfilled the law by calling for a love of God and neighbor. Although this is supposed to be a lifestyle that characterizes all Christians, we have to be called to this over and over again as a prophetic community. Paul said it this way to the church at Ephesus, "But everything exposed by the light is made visible. For what makes everything visible is light. Therefore it is said, get up, sleeper, and rise up from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." When Paul talks about everything being exposed by the light, this doesn't merely mean to see something that was hidden. It is deeper than that. The word for exposed means rebuke, expose, refute, show one's fault, implying that there's a convincing of that fault. What Paul is saying is that the gospel strengthens us through the Spirit to see things in our society that others do not. We are called as the people of God to wake up to see what others don't and call it out. The church in America is not awake to the reality of what is happening in our communities across this nation, and we are missing out on our calling to shine the light into these places of darkness for Christ's glory. I'm so grateful that God saved us to be in relationship with Him, but He also bought us to be in a relationship with one another. God's intent is for us to hurt with one another, not to hurt each other. To care about the suffering of one another. When I think of Nehemiah's tears, I have to wonder when such lament will come from the church body of our white brothers and sisters. Where is the collective voice, the emotive, empathetic, impassioned cry in response to their black brothers and sisters who are suffering and experiencing trauma? It's one thing if a stranger gets shot on the street, we feel for them. We may even pray for them, but when somebody you have a relationship with gets shot, there's a different response because of their nearness, because of connection, because of love. Our division in the church in America is rooted in disconnection from one another. And that, my Christian brothers and sisters, should not be. When Christ returns, all of our bylaws and documents for our organizations will dissolve. We will be consumed with knowing Him and knowing one another. My urgent plea to the church is that we begin to let the future truth impact our present reality. What do you mean by woke? As a church, I'm going to inform some of us today. As a church and as a Christians, we need to utilize the mind of Christ and to be fully awake to the issues of race and justice in this country, no matter what color we might be. Pan-Africanists and black nationalists use the term woke to refer to no longer being naive nor in mental slavery. We have borrowed the term and redeemed it to be used in the context of being awakened from deadened sinful thinking. In fact, every believer has been awakened from sin's effects and Satan's deception. Thus, the believer is able to be aware of sin and challenge it whenever or wherever it is. Woke is a word commonly used by those in the black community as a term for being socially aware of issues that have systemic impact. This social awareness doesn't come from just watching the news or reading history through a traditional lens. Being woke has to do with seeing all of the issues and being able to connect cultural, socioeconomic, philosophical, historical, and ethical dots. A similar term is a consciousness, a conscious. To me, staying woke means making sure that you're tuned into your community, that you are doing everything that you can to not only educate yourself, but to bring someone else along, to ensure that we all have the same information. It's not enough to be woke on our own. You need to help someone else along to get woke. Woke is about a state of mind. Many of us are regeneration focused in a way that ignores the outworking of new life in the world. Historically, when it comes to race and justice, conservative evangelical Christianity didn't have a theology by and large that moved them toward activism. In the book of Titus, Paul applies regeneration. That means the coming of new of our heart. Paul applies the regeneration to the area of comprehensive societal engagement. He lets his readers know that they need to be ready for every good work in their city. This is what Paul wrote to Titus. Let our people learn to devote themselves to good works for pressing needs so that they will not be unfruitful. Pressing needs? Pressing needs are those that are absolutely essential and vitally necessary, indispensable. We can't deny that Paul sees meeting pressing needs as a core Christian commitment, not a peripheral one. We do not substitute proclaiming for action, and we don't proclaim and neglect action. We proclaim and engage in activism that flows from the gospel. To apply this, we must be awakened to the reality of implicit and explicit racism and injustice in our society. Until then, our prophetic voice on these matters will be anemic and silent. Being woke is to be aware. Being woke is to acknowledge the truth. Being woke is to be accountable. Being woke is to be active. This is the call of God on the church and on every believer. We must be, and this is, I think we have a slide. We must be aware, be willing to acknowledge, be accountable, and be active. This cycle is a recurring process throughout life. Understanding that is helpful for all of us. It is no different than how our souls are in constant cycle of transformation and spiritual growth. That is, we understand sin, hearing the word, the conviction of our sin, the confession of our sin, the repentance, faith, and fruits of transformation, and this cycle starts over. Paul says this in Ephesians. He makes this statement, making the most of the time because the days are evil. The King James Version says it this way, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Making the most of the time or redeeming the time, which means to do something with intensity and urgency, to take full advantage in every opportunity. At its best, this concept challenges us to maximize the opportunity for the gospel. Race, justice, dignity are huge issues for gospel common ground. When Christians spend time arguing about what's going on in the public square and not engaging it, we miss redemptive opportunities. With all of that in mind, I want us to turn our attention to a video that I've seen. This is one of the top 10 TED videos that has ever been watched. And it speaks to this. Now, when you hear things like, hey, TED community, or when you hear him speak about us, I want you to replace those terms with me and Christians, or better, the church. When you hear him talking about a group of people, just think in your mind, the church. Because what he's talking about here has so much gospel implications to it. So let's watch and listen. Please. So you heard Brian talking about a group, us, TED community. Hopefully when you were hearing that, you replace that with the church, with Christians, with the sense that when we talk about bringing heaven to earth, Father in heaven, your will be done. When we think about where Jesus Christ aligned himself on this earth with, he always aligned himself with the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten, the castaway. And as a community of faith, as a church, we have to realign ourselves with the thought that that is probably where Jesus would align himself today. Everybody give it up for Dina. Here is one of our one and only great champions, has been a long time youth worker and mentor, was helping in starting our student ministry. I think next door, what was there, like 5 girls or 7 girls that showed up for the first night of our youth group, right?
And 8 leaders.
And 8 leaders. We were ready, man. And so out of that, Dina, really working with our girls here, really had an idea to actually go back to school. Mm-hmm. And you got your master's degree in what?
Restorative Justice.
Restorative Justice. Mm-hmm. So, which is awesome. And so she's been using that now for several years and has started an incredible organization or movement really toward that. Because here's what we talk about, the gospel. We when we think about a detachment, he's talking about the church. He's talking about Christians. He's talking about us. That if anybody should be on the front lines engaging these systemic issues, it ought to be the church. But when he says, but there is a silence, we could just say, there's a huge silence in the church. When you hear that, Dina, talk to us a little bit. What resonates in your heart hearing just that? And I know you've heard a lot of him and studied him. How does that move your heart when you hear that and the work of restorative justice?
So I'll just tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk a little bit about what restorative practices is, and then what restorative justice is within that. So restorative practices is about strong, positive relationships build strong, positive communities. And when there's a breakdown in that relationship, there's a process in there called restorative justice to really bring people back into the community within a healthy way. And so what that speaks to me, and as a church, it talks about Jesus and his two greatest commandments, to love God and to love others. Yeah. And so what does that mean when the church truly begins to love God and to love other people? And so it's building those relationships and going to to people who don't necessarily look like us, like we do here. And meeting people where they are, not necessarily inside our own comfort zone, but meeting people where they are and meeting the needs of other people where they are, which is why I really love Renovation Church. And I have to say, appreciate you so much that we have these kind of conversations, whereas you bring in people that talk about, where the cross meets the street and what that looks like. So we stand in restorative practice. There's a process that we stand for those whose voices have been silenced. And what does that process look like? What does it truly look like being the hands and feet of Jesus and walking out and meeting people where they are, and then meeting those needs of those people where they are to reintegrate people back into community in a healthy way and to build on those strong relationships. And so when we begin to look at systems like our education system, and we look at our criminal justice system, and we're looking at systems to make the changes that truly, I believe in my heart, the church should be doing.
Yeah. So when you think about systems, we just kind of have a tendency to treat the government like a lot of us as parents treat teachers in the school. It's a drop-off. It's somebody else's responsibility to teach my kids. It's somebody else's responsibility. Hey, the church, it's your responsibility to teach my kids about God stuff. No, we have to take ownership of that. And the church should be in the front of the line when it comes to, when you talk about restorative practices, that's the gospel.
That's the gospel.
Paul says we are to be ambassadors of reconciliation. Is that not the champion of reconciliation, right?
It's a champion. And when you talk about getting woke, this was our responsibility.
Yeah.
This responsibility was taken away from the church by the government.
Yeah.
This was our responsibility. And we have, from my experience, fallen asleep on that responsibility. And so we need to get woke and reclaim the responsibility that we have to love one another.
So in earlier, Dr. Mason makes this statement, and he gives us these, and I don't know if you can put that back up there, but being woke means, and we're going to wrap this up. I'm just really, as I said, this is just kind of a conversation that I want us to begin to have. It's like parents, it's like the sex talk. And you can't have a sex talk. It's a conversation. It's not a one and done. It's forever and ever, right? At different seasons, right? So this idea about race and reconciliation, all these, this isn't a one and done. We're not going to kind of get, well, Breck, come on, you're gonna. I get tired of, why do we keep coming back? We keep coming back because we got so much work to do.
We got a lot of work to do.
And so we're going to continue to come back. And so here's these 4 things that, if you could put up on the screen, we must, as a church, and today, as we close today, think about this. When it comes to asking the Holy Spirit, God, how can I engage in this? Because it's easy for us to simply go, that's somebody else's issue. It's somebody else's problem. That's not the school system my kids are in. That's not the neighborhood that I'm living in. We have to be willing to engage this. We have to be aware. We have to be willing to acknowledge what has gone on. And we have to be accountable. And we have to be active. So in 60 seconds, tell us about the big day that's coming up.
Okay. And so in being aware and being willing to acknowledge and being accountable, and being active. Erie County Restorative Justice Coalition, which is highly supported by Renovation Church. We are just right next door. Our office is just right next door. But every year at UB, we sponsor what is called Restorative Justice Day. We advocate for more restorative practices in our schools, in our courts, and in our community. And so we spend a day, goes from 9 to 5, just really talking about the benefits of using more restorative practices within community. It gives you an opportunity to know more about what restorative practice is, but I'll give you an even earlier opportunity to do that every Thursday. So every fourth Thursday, right next door in the office upstairs, we have what we call restorative practice, role-playing practice. So it gives you the ability to be more aware about what restorative practice is, gives you ability to practice that practice and to meet some community members and talking about what is happening in the community, empowering us to be the change of our own change in community. That happens every fourth Thursday right next door from 5:30 to 7:30. So if you want to know about what restorative practice is before you even get to Restorative Justice Day, which is at UB on the North Campus, on the North Campus, South Campus, it's on the South Campus, on Diefendorf Hall. It's $5 to come, but it also includes your breakfast and it includes lunch as well. But it's a full day. We have a national speaker coming in. His name is Dr. Robert Spicer, and he has changed schools in Chicago. We also have another keynote speaker coming in. His name is Bob Costello, and he's coming in to talk about the criminal justice system and how restorative practice has impacted the criminal justice system in New York City. So we're looking to mirror that as well. Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
I really need you guys to be in prayer because the day before that, we have a number of city leaders who have agreed to gather together. There's 25 of us to come together in a circle and talk about how we can do some practical steps in healing our city. And so we need that in prayer as well.
Yeah. So Dina's right here. She's a part of us. You don't have to lead an organization like Dina's doing, but you can be a part of an organization that Dina's. We have Saphir's right over here. Saphir, raise your hand right there, right? Sophomore at Canisius. I went last year and he led a breakout session on restorative and he killed it, right? So we got young champions and he's about ready to walk over to Renovation Station and serve your kids, right? So we have to be engaged. We can't sit and soak and be silent. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
I don't know.
So just even saying part of that, we have Brandy Loveland who's already over there, who's our director of community engagement. So she's already over there working in Renovation Station today, and she's doing a Get Woke series right now in 4 high schools at the Saturday Community Program in Buffalo Public Schools. Wow. So there's tons of opportunities to get involved. Yeah. So come on board.
Dina, would you close us in a word of prayer?
Oh, I love it. Heavenly